Hi, I'm Mark Sappenfield, editor of the Christian Science Monitor, and we're so happy to have you with us today for our Facebook Live event about civility and trust. Today, we will be joined by someone who we've been following since last autumn when she published her book, The Soul of Civility, Timeless Principles to Heal Society and Ourselves. That's Alexandra Hudson. She founded Civic Renaissance, which is a publication in a community that educates people on beauty and goodness and truth, which are all things we love and will love to talk about today. She's also been a contributor to CBS News, to Fox News, to the Wall Street Journal, to Politico, and to us. We had a conversation with her on our own pages last November. That's a great thing to go back to and got us excited about this conversation too. She has a master's degree in public policy from the London School of Economics. She is an adjunct professor at the Indiana University Lilly School of Philanthropy, and her book, Soul of Civility, was published in the fall by St. Martin's Press. She's joining us from Indianapolis. So today, in my conversation with Alexandra, we're going to be focusing a lot on the intersection between civility and trust. And there's good reasons for that. First of all, it's a major theme in Alexandra's book. But also, the Monitor has been focusing on trust for the past 3 months. We have a project that we call Rebuilding Trust. And as you might imagine, it's about how trust is so fundamental to so many of the things that we see in the news today. And it looks at where we need to build trust, but it also looks at places where people are building trust. If you want to see that, all you need to do is go to the Monitor's homepage. It's really clearly there for the links. That's csmonitor.com, and you can check that out. And before we start, just 2 quick notes. We're going to be recording this. So if you'd like to see a recording of it, please email us at events@csmonitor.com. You can also go to that same email address, events@csmonitor.com, for more information about Alexandra's book and about our trust series. So, Alexandra, we've been looking forward to this. Let's just jump right in. Let's just start. I think we need to define our terms a little bit. You know, when people hear the word civility, that can be a really misunderstood word. And you spend a lot of the beginning of your book just kind of saying, what is civility and what isn't it? Just kind of very briefly describe for me, what is civility and why is it so important to understanding that?
Thanks, Mark. Thanks for having me today. Thank you for the Monitor, for your role in promoting these ideals of civil discourse and tolerance and respect across difference that are so direly needed in our world today, and to our mutual friend and colleague, Stephen Humphreys, for connecting us. Really on all fronts. Glad to be here. That's my challenge and opportunity, is that of writing this book and of, the promotion of the last 6 months. And but it is that everyone thinks they know what civility is, and in fact, no one does. And so that's kind of my hook, my argument. I argue that there's an essential distinction between civility and politeness. And today we hear these words often used interchangeably, whether people want more civility and politeness or less. We hear people say that it's a tool of the patriarchy, of white supremacists, of the oppressors, of the people who are powerful in society. We need less civility and politeness for greater justice and equity in our world. And I argue that both these groups, of both these voices, miss this essential distinction between civility and politeness that I make at the beginning and argue for throughout the book. I argue that politeness is manners, it's etiquette, it's technique, it's external stuff. Whereas civility is deeper, it's richer, it's a disposition of the heart, it's an orientation towards others, a way of seeing others as our fundamental moral equals, worthy of a bare minimum of respect, just by virtue of our shared moral status, our dignity as members of the human community. And that sometimes actually respecting someone, actually loving someone, requires being impolite. It requires having a hard conversation, telling a hard truth, engaging in robust debate, even risking hurting someone's feelings, offending them. That the stuff of politeness is, sweeping a difference under the rug, polishing over it, and not wanting to hurt someone's feelings, which can actually be an expression of self-interest, but it's actually a way to love and respect others, to tell them a hard truth, not coddle them, not patronize them and pretend a difficult disagreement or issue doesn't exist when it does. So I argue in the book that we should aim for civility, and too often we're satisfied today with mere politeness, mere the mere form of goodness and virtue and respect. And instead, we should focus on whether we actually respect people in a way that sometimes might require offending people and telling hard truths.
And you and I have talked in the run up to this event, and we could go on for a long time, but I love the way in the book when you're talking about that distinction, you point to the civil rights movement, who clearly, told very hard truths, but always from a very clear perspective and always with a very clear goal.
Mm-hmm. It's a great point.
So also at other times in your book, you talk about, where does civility come from? And you've talked about that civility is only possible when you consent to seeing the humanity in others. And I would just say during the course of our Rebuilding Trust series, we found pretty much the exact same thing, that you can't build trust unless you consent to see the humanity in others. Mm-hmm. What do you see as the connection between those two things, between trust and civility? Because they do seem so interconnected.
I explore the theme of trust in many chapters of my book. Two that come to mind. One is my chapter on integrity. And in my chapter on integrity, I talk about this inherent information asymmetry in social life, that when it comes to life with others, all we have to go on when assessing whether we can trust someone is what we see, how someone dresses, how someone talks, how they act, how they present themselves in the world. And unfortunately, this information asymmetry is that we never really know what's going on inside someone's heart. All we can go by is what we see. And unfortunately, what we see, appearances don't always match up with reality. And I learned this firsthand in government when I saw these two contingents when I served in government, and that was a very dispiriting experience I had in federal government that galvanized me to write this book and be part of the solution, help us think more clearly about this most essential question of our day, of how we flourish across deep difference. And when I was in government, I saw these two extremes. On one hand, there were people who were bellicose, belligerent, hostile, and at least you knew where they stood. I knew to avoid those people because I knew what their modes of contact are. They were willing to steamroll anyone to get ahead. There was another contingent, though, that was polished, poised, and polite, but they would smile and flatter me and others one moment and stab us in the back the next. One day, a colleague came up to me and said, "Hi, Lexi, you look gorgeous, and you're so brilliant. And by the way, I'm a little behind on this project. Would you mind helping me?" And I was happy to help. And he proceeded to then give me the entire project and expect me to do the whole project for him, which I was happy to do. I had some bandwidth to do it. But then he takes my work, passes it off as his own, and takes all the credit and meetings and associated with it that he wasn't prepared for because he didn't do the work. And then, crucially, gone were the pleasantries. Gone was the flattery. The moment he had gotten what he needed, what he wanted from me, I was, cast aside. And I felt really used. I felt really instrumentalized. I knew, that the polish and the flattery, the obsequiousness, that was a pretense. It was a ruse. It was using politeness, the appearance of goodness and virtue and friendship to get me to do something. And then the moment that he got what he wanted, that was gone. And so
I'm guessing that didn't do a lot for your trust.
Right, exactly. Yeah. I was like, I'm not going to help you. Obviously, we're going to work together, but I'm not going to be as inclined to support you and do you any favors again in the future. And so I unpack this information asymmetry, that what we see is not always what we get. Etiquette is not ethics. Manners are not always morals. There is this mismatch sometimes between inner and outer. Integrity is when all the parts of self make sense together, that our outer actions are corroborated by an inner character. Orthopraxy and orthodoxy, right practice is backed up by right belief, inner and outer. And, I talk about how the best way to promote trust in society is to be trustworthy people ourselves, people who, walk the walk and talk the talk. We are who we present ourselves to the world. And so that's one area I talk about trust in the book. This mismatch between manners and etiquette and morals and ethics. And I also talk about it in the chapter on civil society, where I talk about how civility, just common decency to the other, is this thing that supports social trust, that supports our democracy and our civil society.
And so also in the book, you talk about what happens when that collapses or when that declines. You end up in a society where people are not willing to do things for other things, when there's always mistrust is kind of the beginning state. And that becomes a very frustrating and inefficient society. It's very hard to get anything done when you don't have trust, because there isn't that basis to start from. kind of when you look at, let's focus on the United States right now. When you look at the United States right now, where do you think we are on that path in terms of, that slider, if you will, from having trust to being mistrust, and that frustration that comes with a lack of trust and a lack of civility?
It's a great question. I mean, my lived experience right now definitely has me very cynical about the state of, trustworthiness and my fellow citizens. I am renovating a 115-year-old historic home, and I am forced to trust strangers every day. I have people come into my home, they say they're going to do work and they take a deposit, and sometimes they run away with my money, and it's so frustrating. It's like, I feel stuck. I don't know what to do. People who come up to me, they shake my hand, they look me in the eye, they play with my children in my backyard, and then they drive off with my money, or they start a project and then quit halfway through. And it's just like, it's exhausting and infuriating. And I don't have a perfect answer for it, because again, it gets to this mismatch, right? Like
Right.
I look for all the cues. Like for example, one thing I've started to really, really, use as a barometer for someone's trustworthiness is whether they can show up on time to a meeting that we set. If they can't show up when they say they're going to set, or, I'll often start them off with a smaller project, like a very contained scope before giving them a bigger one. That, scripture says, he who is faithful in small things will be faithful in great things. And that's something I've really relied on. But even then, I've had people who are able to do small things well. And then when it comes to the bigger things, they fall apart and their character is tested and shown, and they run away. And it is hard. I don't have a perfect answer for it.
Yeah.
I do think generally, though, we have to, this is what I've learned, I have to still trust people. I have to still give the benefit of the doubt, even though it feels like I've had disproportionate exposure to like con artists in the world, people who that that's still not fair to others for me to assume the worst.
Right.
And I have to give every person I meet a fresh start, assume that they are a good person who's going to do good work and do what they say they're going to do. And I can't really operate and I can't function in the world otherwise. Yes, it's inefficient to go around, as Putnam gives these great examples in Bowling Alone of people who lock their doors at night, who have to, that's a transaction cost. People who count their change, that's a transaction, as opposed to just assuming that your cashier has counted your change. That's a cost that causes these low grade aggravations and takes its toll in daily life together. So we do trust others, and we have to. And the challenge is, what do we do when we encounter untrustworthy people? How do we not let that isolated experience define how we interact with everyone and generalize that? Exactly. It's a hard thing to do, but we have to. That's the way to really respect our fellow citizens, is to have to assume the benefit of the doubt, give them the benefit of the doubt.
And hold on to that thought. I'm just going to remind people really quickly that if you are interested in reading or hearing about our Rebuilding Trust stories, just a reminder to go to the homepage, which is csmonitor.com, and you can see everything that we've done on this. Just to continue kind of building along this, to me, that's, when I read your book, that's where civility comes in, is that, okay, trust, that is, like you say, trust can only be built by trustworthiness. If you're not trustworthy, then trust is hard to build. But it seems that what you're saying is, civility is kind of the non-negotiable. Whether you run away with my money or something like that, having that civility, again, going back to what you said about the civil rights movement, is they were being civil to people who were lynching them, who were killing them. You can't do anything worse than killing someone. And yet the civility was a table stake. It was never departed from. And to me, in some ways, the book that you write is the way out of that, is to create that bedrock of society. I don't know how that strikes you, but it just, as you were talking, occurred to me. That's one thing I took from your book.
It's a great point. Thank you. Yeah, I do elevate the nonviolent resistance movement of Gandhi, of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., both of whom were influenced by Henry David Thoreau, who understood that in their pursuit of justice, of equity, of equal recognition of human dignity under the law, for, in Gandhi's case, the Indian people, and in Dr. King's case, African Americans, who are subject to a culture and a formal laws, but also norms that did not treat all human beings equally, that they knew the means mattered. They knew that they could not instrumentalize their opponents, burn them all down, cut them all to the ground, in order to achieve their goal, because they could, in their pursuit of equal recognition and respect for human dignity. They couldn't undermine the dignity of some people, their fellow citizens, fellow human beings along the way. They were bound by their own their own values. And Gandhi has this great line. He says that it's easy to say that the means don't matter, that the ends justify the means. But Gandhi says, no, no, no. The
Yeah.
means are in fact everything.
Mm.
And I want to be clear, like I'm not a total pacifist. Like movements like Gandhi and like that which Gandhi and Dr. King led, they wouldn't have worked. They didn't work against the Third Reich or the Soviet Union, these like monstrous, barbaric, dehumanizing regimes. So I do think there is a time and a place. I'm not a total pacifist. I think there's a time and a place for action, for force. But I do think that they have so much to teach us. You know, we're surrounded by a lot of apocalyptic rhetoric, a lot of people who feel like the stakes are very high and they're willing all too quickly to instrumentalize people who get in their way in order to achieve their greater good. And I think that we need to take serious pause with that sort of instrumentalizing of others, sort of apocalyptic thinking where we have God on our side, we have justice on our side. That's just so dangerous. It's so dangerous.
It does feel to me like that is a lesson that we could relearn, the idea that means matter, because it seems like we're so focused on the ends that we're giving up the means in order to get to the ends
Yes.
that we want. And in your book, one of the passages that I really enjoyed is you were talking about Alexis de Tocqueville, who was a kind of a French political scientist, we'd call him today, from the 1800s, who was fascinated by America and what kind of the founding of America could teach. And he talked about the need for us to renew, for each generation to relearn democratic values, to relearn how to be democratic. And he said specifically that when Americans got together in groups and hammered out problems despite their differences, he called them schools for democracy, which I thought was a great phrase that you used. Where do you, I mean, do you see those schools for democracy happening in places around the United States? I mean, you go around to the United States, all over the world, you do these talks. This is kind of your head is here all the time. What are you actually seeing when you go out and do these things?
It's a great point. You know, there's a lot of really thoughtful people talking about the perils of our digitally mediated communication and time spent doom scrolling on social media and what that's doing to, you know, our mental health these days. Those I think can rightfully be said are not laboratories of democracy, to spending endless time on social media. But, you know, the good news is, and this is what the Monitor is so excellent at doing, just highlighting these lesser told stories of hope and elevation, is that there is this renaissance of I call them, you know, tortures. You know, that what part of my story is that when I left government, I came home from work one day and said to my husband, I'm done with DC. I'm done with toxic politics. Let's move to Indiana. That was my idea. I'm not from Indiana. I'm from Los Angeles, raised in Vancouver, Canada. But, you know, I just had this idea, this image in my mind of the bucolic, you know, rolling hills and pastures of the American Midwest. And I was like, I gotta get out of the swamp. And my husband says, okay, sounds good. We'll move to Indiana, where he's from. And he said, no take backs. And a few months later, we moved out there, and we've been here 6 years now. And one of my first friends, when we moved here, her name was Joanna Taft. She came up to me after church one day and said, hi, I'm Joanna. Would you like to porch with us sometime? And I never heard the word porch used as a verb before, but we were curious. We didn't have many friends in town, so we went. And I realized that Joanna is staging a quiet revolution against our atomized, divided, low trust, alienated status quo from the vantage point of her great big front veranda on her historic home downtown Indianapolis. She had curated people across these silos that really exist today. And that's one thing about our culture, that it does teach us to fear the different, fear the other. That seems like a pervasive kind of drumbeat in our media today that is really harmful to social trust. And so she had put people across these different silos, across race, politics, geography, social class, into close proximity to rehumanize people across difference, to sow these seeds of trust and friendship that blossomed over time, but also began to germinate that day. It wasn't this place where we were having structured conversation across difference. You know, you say your bit and I say mine, and we're going to hash this debate out. It was just a place to remind us that we shared way more in common as human beings, as citizens of this great country, than what differentiates us. It was a place for us to be seen and known and loved in the fullness of who we are as human beings. And that is so rare. These moments to have in-person corporeal interactions with people across these differences. It's just, this is one thing that is so, a drumbeat in my book is that this is actually a timeless problem, this timeless problem of people not being trustworthy, of division, of human self-love trumping and taking precedent over the human social project, which is the good life. And that has always been thus across time and place. It's not a new problem. But one thing that is different in our moment, there are many things that are different, despite the timelessness of this problem, is just how easy it is to go about our lives and not really encounter people who are different from us, who we don't want to encounter, who we don't like, we don't want to be around. We can curate our lives almost perfectly.
The
Virtually,
bubbles we build. Yeah.
right. Virtually, we know this is the case. We can just unfollow, unfriend, silence, mute. The echo chambers, we hear a lot about that. But also physically, in the world of digital work, we don't have to leave our homes if we don't want to. Or if we do leave our homes, it's like car, office, and back again. We get our groceries delivered. We have Netflix. We have Grubhub.
Listen to our podcasts.
That's right. It's just so easy to
Yeah.
surround ourselves with just the people and the ideas and the things that we like, and that is different, from past eras where there were these, the agora, right, and this forum in ancient Greece where you went to the market and the kind of the marketplace of life and ideas. Those are increasingly rare today, and that's a problem. And so that's why stories like Joanna's are so powerful and so beautiful. And I realized when I was a Novak journalism fellow, I traveled the country and met and enjoyed meals with and people who are with and without front porches doing what Joanna's doing. They're creating spaces to convene people across these differences in coffee shops, on their front stoops, on their dock. Someone hosted a book launch party for me in Miami, Florida, and they had this beautiful dock overlooking the ocean. And I was like, we're porching right now. Like, it's not about the physical orientation of the space. It's about the intention and the makeup and the disposition of civility, wanting to create these oases from the division, from the animosity, that help us, reclaim our common humanity across these differences and feel seen and known and loved in the fullness of who we are. And we can do that too. That's the empowering message, that people are doing this, and it's not a superpower. We can start right now. It's not about whether we have the porch. It's about how we use what we do have and opening up our homes and hearts to others.
Yes. I'm going to pause just quickly here and remind people that if you're interested in a Christian Science Monitor daily newsletter, which is full of these ideas that we're talking about, stories of hope and progress and a different take on the news, you can get that subscriber-only newsletter each weeknight through a 30-day free trial, and that's at csmonitor.com/free trial, in case you're interested in that. As you were talking, Alexandra, something that came to me from your book is where you mentioned Albert Schweitzer, and he was someone who was kind of way ahead of his time in recognizing the evils of colonialism and what that did to local populations. And one of the ways he tried to address it was by going and opening up a hospital in Africa, which I mentioned in one of my recent columns called Lambarene. And so he was asked, just as you were talking about, Alexandra, what do I do about this? Doing these things seems so hard. And he says, we all have to find our own Lambarene. And so to me, what you're talking about is that doesn't matter what it is, can be porching, can be a whole, can be what you do, which is going out and, giving your whole self to trying to figure out how to solve this, but find something and do something and go forward.
You're absolutely right. If I could just jump in quickly,
of course.
Two things that stand out to me about Schweitzer's story that are relevant to our conversation. One, we were talking about at the beginning of our conversation, trust and the mismatch between how we present ourselves to the world and the things we say and how we actually act or who we actually are on the inside. And one thing Schweitzer says, it's a great line. He says, my life is my testimony. Like he wanted his life, the way that he lived his life. He didn't want to be that person that parrots, virtue and self-sacrifice and selflessness. He wanted to live it. And he wanted that to be the greatest testament to his values and ideals. And I think that in this world today where it's so easy, to virtue signal and say and do the right things and, but actually not live your lives because that's private. What you put on Twitter is different than how you actually live your life in your everyday. That I think Schweitzer is just such a good role model and example to us to invert that, actually prioritize not what you say, but actually what you do. and how you live over time. Like character is habit long continued. And, Schweitzer lived a life that was dedicated to the ideals of equal human dignity, of service and sacrifice, which is so countercultural in our moment, that prizes, self-indulgence and self above all. So, and the other thing is exactly what you said. Schweitzer said we must all create and cultivate our own Lambaréné. And I love I'm just back from book tour in France and in the UK. And especially in France, I quoted a lot the end of Voltaire's Candide. And Candide is this tiny little novella about the problem of evil and injustice in the world and what can we do. And at the end of Candide, Voltaire writes, "We must cultivate our garden. That we can't change the world, but we can change ourselves. And that all that we can do is cultivate our garden when it comes to all these injustices in the world. When it comes to, and this is what I say in the chapter on social trust, when it comes to this macro problem that we live in a low trust society, what can we do? We can up our efforts, double down our efforts to be trustworthy people of integrity ourselves."
I mean, to quote you, I mean, what you're talking about to me is living with the soul of civility. It's that soul idea of it's not just a surface thing. It's something that's very deep rooted. Do you want to get to one? We had some questions from some readers before the start. I want to make sure we get to one, and it goes to something that I also had to think about from your book. The question is, how much of a factor is civility in nations where democracy is flourishing and at the opposite end of the spectrum where democracy is not available? And I was very interested in this question because I spent a lot of time as a journalist in Afghanistan, where there's very, very low trust. Civility is probably not a civic value in the way that it is here. So I saw these things playing out in different contexts, and just it's kind of all talked about in your book a little bit. What would you say in answer to that question?
It's a great question. There's a reason, I do have our core argument in my book is that civility, considering the needs and well-being of our fellow citizens alongside of ourselves voluntarily, and restraining what we might otherwise want for the sake of others, that is an essential ingredient in a civil society and for democracy. So democracy does play a I argue for democracy in my book, but I also draw from sources and tell stories and examine eras in history that predate democracy. We forget that democracy is relatively new in the narrative of human history. It's, arguably goes back to ancient Greece, but in terms of it being a kind of a really global concept, and it's just a few hundred years old. And actually civility is essential even to non-democratic cultures too. In my chapter 2 of my book, I survey, many pre-democratic cultures. I go across time and across place and tease out ideas from what I think are some of the most important and interesting thinkers from across history and culture on this topic of the good life. And remarkably, people have come to the similar ideas about the stuff of the good life and human flourishing, from the oldest book in the world, the teachings of Ptahhotep, given to us 2350 BC, which has maxims like, do not be good to your friends and neighbors just when you want something. Be good to your friends and neighbors all the time. He says, don't abuse a power differential. Ptahhotep says this, ancient Egyptian vizier that wrote this 4,000 years ago. He says, be good and gentle and gracious to the vulnerable. And he says, don't slander. It's amazing. Like, don't gossip on, don't malign someone when they can't defend themselves. And these and so many others of his 37 maxims in his book, the oldest book in the world, The Teachings of Ptahhotep, are remarkably relevant and similar today. I go to ancient Greece. I go to the Middle Ages. I go across time and place to show that there is this kind of core of human wisdom. Sometimes it was iterative, that people were influenced by those that came before them, as we should be. But sometimes people will just thoughtfully observed the human condition and said, what works when it comes to doing life together, what doesn't? And let's do more of what works, less of what doesn't.
I love that. That's so practical. Just one final question before we end. I was listening to the interview that you did with my colleague, Stephen Humphreys, back in November, and you said something that I just loved. You said we need to push politics back into its natural place and recover things that are more ennobling. And you've obviously talked about, I mean, that's what this whole conversation has been about. But just to kind of sum up and close us out, what are some of those ennobling things that we need to recover?
I argue in the final chapter of my book, it's called On Misplaced Meaning and Forgiveness. And I argue that we've actually made idols out of politics, political issues, and public life. Too often, as these traditional touchstones of meaning, religion and faith and church and family and community, these have been places where we have traditionally derived our identity and sources of meaning, but that these have been misplaced in public issues. And there are many symptoms of this, and this is deeply concerning. But I do argue that, given that we've misplaced our meaning in public life and public issues, we're overdoing democracy and undermining democracy. It's detrimental to our regime and our freedom and our flourishing, but also to our own souls too, to expect too much out of politics and to derive our ultimate meaning from these issues. And so I give a few suggestions of ways in which we can put politics back in its proper place and recover the territory of our souls for more ennobling and uplifting and joy-filled things. We're all kind of having the hard conversations about the culture wars day in, day out. We're oversaturated by it constantly. We need to relegate it to its proper place and make room for things like beauty and the sublime, having awe walks and daily doses of wonder that displace our sense of self, give us a sense of our smallness in the vastness of the universe. Like, that is so good for us. There's a whole literature on transcendence and awe that is so important for the state of our souls, and I think could go a long way to help our democracy and divided state. I talk about friendship. We are lonely. We are really hurting. And there's a cliche that hurt people, but I see that constantly in our world, just the viciousness and the cruelty in our public life. That doesn't come out of nowhere in a vacuum. And so what does it mean to look at that as a symptom of our crisis of alienation and loneliness, and encouraging people to, recover friendship, especially friendship across difference? I talk about curiosity, not just saying, I see you voted for Trump, or that your view on the vaccine, and I know everything there is to know about you, and whether I want you in my life, whether I want to be your friend, and letting that part define the whole, instead of assuming we know everything about someone based on one thing about them. Staying curious, saying, that's so interesting that you have a view that is so radically different than mine. Tell me more, and tell me your story. And we're so quick to make these assumptions that we know and essentialize people to one aspect of who they are. But what about, cultivating and our curiosity muscles, and everyone is so complex and comes to their views about the world for many different reasons, including us. And recovering curiosity can go a long way to relegating our toxic politics to its proper place.
I love that. Awe, friendship, and curiosity. It's a great thing. Thank you so much, Alexandra. We're so grateful you joined us today. And thank you, everyone, for coming to this event on civility and healing with Alexandra Hudson, the author of The Soul of Civility, Timeless Principles to Heal Society and Ourselves by St. Martin's Press. If you missed some of this conversation and you want to view it again, just send us an email at events@csmonitor.com. That's events@csmonitor.com, and we will send you a link to the recording. And a reminder that if you are interested in the 1-month free trial to the Christian Science Monitor Daily, you can get that at csmonitor.com/free trial, csmonitor.com/free trial. Before we go, we just want to say thank you to some of the people behind the screen on the event. Our events team is led by Promotion and Events Manager Lauren Crandall and Associate Product Manager Casey Fetty. Greg Fitzgerald produced our event with support from Mandy K. Peshek and Sophie Fody. Our studio crew included Technical Director Ian Blakir, producers Vincent Lamascolo and Morgan Anderson, audio technician Tim Malone, and Noel Flatt did our encoding and was our web delivery engineer. I'm Mark Sappenfield, editor of the Christian Science Monitor. Thank you so much for joining us.